Good afternoon, and welcome to our conversation today. I'd like to begin by making a land acknowledgement that the Art Gallery of Ontario is on the traditional territory of the Mississauga of the New Credit, and also home of the Huron, Wendat, and Haudenosaunee people through time. Welcome, everyone, to Art in the Spotlight, and especially to Jay Clarke, who's joining me today, as we look at the work of German artist Käthe Kollwitz, a leading 20th century printmaker and sculptor who is well known for her uncompromising images of social and political upheaval. My name is Brenda Rix. I've been a member of the AGO's curatorial team since the early 1980s, and I'm currently manager of the Print and Drawing Studies Center. I've curated numerous exhibitions for the AGO, and in 2018, I wrote the publication Käthe Kollwitz, According to the Truths, and curated 3 installations based on a major donation in 2015 of Kollwitz works, which included 170 prints, drawings, and sculptures from Toronto collector, Dr. Brian McCrindle. I'm joined today by my colleague and friend, Jay Clarke. Welcome, Jay. J.A. Clarke is the Rothman Family Curator of Prints and Drawings at the Art Institute of Chicago. She was the Manton Curator of Prints, Drawings, and Photography at the Clarke Art Institute in Williamstown, Massachusetts from 2009 to 2018. Jay has written extensively and curated many exhibitions in the area of 19th and 20th century art. In 2020, she contributed the essay, Kollwitz, Gender, Biography, and Social Activism, to the publication Käthe Kollwitz, Prints, Process, Politics, which was published by the Getty Research Institute. Jay received her master's degree and her doctorate from Brown University. Jay and I have known each other for over 20 years, and in the early 2000s, we collaborated on the exhibition Käthe Kollwitz, The Art of Compassion, which was held here at the Art Gallery of Ontario in 2003. The exhibition was popular and well received in Toronto, and Kollwitz's images of suffering and protest were thought to be particularly timely and really struck a chord, given that the night the exhibition opened, the US went into Iraq, and the war in Iraq was well and truly underway during the course of the exhibition. The Globe and Mail newspaper at the time remarked on the uncanny timing of our exhibition. I think there are many times in the last 75 years since Kollwitz's death when someone might have commented on the uncanny timing of her work. Once again, at a time of crisis, when we are faced with difficult realities, such as the global pandemic of COVID-19, and also with protests against anti-Black racism, once again, we find Kollwitz's art seems very relevant. So today, we'd like to address the question, why does Kollwitz's art have such staying power and resonance so many decades after her death? And we'd like to do this by looking at a few of our favorite works. And I'll just mention that the audience can ask questions in the comment section, and if there's time at the end, we will try to answer your questions. So I would like to welcome Jay at this time again, and ask her if she would be so kind as to introduce the artist to us and tell us a little bit about a couple of her iconic works. Thanks, Jay.
Thank you. It's really an honor to participate in this webinar and to join the Art Gallery of Ontario's members in their interest in Kollwitz. And it's especially an honor to be doing this virtually with Brenda. As she said, we've known each other for a long time. I've long admired her scholarship and the important work that she has done to bring the art of Käthe Kollwitz to prominence and better understanding in North America. So Kollwitz, her first name, in case you're curious, is pronounced Käthe. It looks like Kathy, but it's actually Käthe Kollwitz. She was born in 1867 in Königsberg, which was then Prussia, but is now in the area of Russia. And she was born to a very staunch social democratic family, and which very much impacted her future socialist leanings, her own political leanings later in life. She lived through both the First and the Second World Wars, if you can imagine, and she died just before the end of the Second World War. She was then in sort of in exile. She was considered a degenerate artist by Hitler, and she lived and worked mostly in Berlin from the 1880s, late 1880s, through just prior to her death. So women artists were not allowed in the German academies when she was training. And so she was taught privately in schools in Munich and in Berlin in the late 1880s and early 1890s. And Brenda, would you mind putting the first slide up?
Sure. Here we go. Just get that. And sorry, here we go.
So her first real critical acclaim came with a portfolio that was called, as you see these two images on the screen, A Weaver's Revolt. And we see 2 of the 6 sheets in this series of prints. And the story recounts a group of Silesian linen weavers from the 1844. It was a real historical event. And they were revolting against poor working conditions, low pay, and poverty. So these 2 works, on the left, we see the weavers gathering with their scythes and their axes, and they're marching towards the factory owner's house. And on the right, we see them arriving at the factory owner's gate. We can see it's a very, beautiful, ornate ironwork fence. And here we see them gathering. The woman in the immediate foreground is gathering rocks in her apron. You see her foreshortened. I'll put my cursor, well, it's not gonna work because I don't have control, but in any case, you'll see her in the foreground, and she's gathering rocks and handing it to the men and women who are then gonna revolt against the factory owner. And it's important that in all of her images of revolt, we see both men and women and even children. So here again, the woman in the foreground is handing the rocks. And then on the right, you see a woman with a baby in one arm, and she's bringing a child with the other hand. So women are very much a part of the revolt and a part of her political message. So she won a medal the very first time she exhibited this work in 1898 at a very important art exhibition in Berlin. And her work was relatively well received in the papers, but then the emperor, literally the emperor of Germany at the time, decided to take away her medal because he felt that her work was too politically inflammatory. And he also said that women should not be awarded medals. In fact, women had won medals at the Berlin Art Academy before, but their imagery was very, what was then would have been deemed feminine and appropriate, whereas Kollwitz's was seen as inflammatory. Can we go to the next slide, please, Brenda?
Sure. Sorry. There we go.
So this is a very, very powerful image, and it's probably one of her best known images of loss and grief. The final work is the one on the right called Woman with Dead Child from 1903. And this work was initially conceived as part of her next major print series, which was called The Peasants War, which we'll tell you about in the next couple of slides, but it remained a standalone image. And we see a preparatory drawing at the top left, which is in the Getty Research Institute. And what we see is a woman holding her dead child, clutching. She's nude, the child is nude, and she's clutching the child in grief. And here Kollwitz is really kind of working out the composition. And you see there's a central square, and then there's an outer rectangle. And she adds another piece of paper because she hasn't quite finished the composition. She wants to add to the top of it, as you can see. And on the right is the final print. And what we see here is actually a portrait of Kollwitz herself holding her son, Peter. And she talks about in her diaries how she made this image while looking in a mirror, as artists have done for centuries with their self-portraits. And the interesting thing about this particular image is it is often described as having foreshadowed her son's later death. He died in the very early months of World War I in 1914. And the interesting thing about, people always say it as a matter of foreshadowing, but he was actually 7 years old when she made this image. So how could she have possibly known that 11 years later her son was going to die? So that's something we might address a little bit later, the question of how her biography has sometimes helped her reception and at other times hindered her reception. But there's a sort of universality and timelessness, I would say, in this image. Everyone, you know, especially now, people losing family members and loved ones from COVID-19, it has this really very visceral, very atemporal quality. We could go to the next one, Brenda. Thank you. So as I mentioned, she worked on this next major series, the Peasants War, for a period of 6 years. And she went from, you know, scenes of many people in it, as we saw with the Weavers' Rebellion, to more focused images. And this is one work that she created in preparation for the Peasants' War, but ended up not using, which is why it says it's a rejected first version. And what we see here is a woman who's sitting down, she's holding a scythe, and then behind her is a giant. You can see his knees are basically up at his shoulders. He's crouching down next to her and putting her hand on the scythe, whispering into her ear to revolt against her oppressors. And that's why it's called Inspiration. And I've always found it really fascinating because it's one of the very few symbolic images in her work. Everything is usually, you know, sort of stark realism, but here we see this inspirational giant who may or may not have wings behind him, which you can vaguely see in the shadows. Next one, please. So again, the Peasants' War, we see two images from it here, focuses on the events from a woman's perspective as opposed to a man's perspective. And here we see another image of sharpening the scythe, the one that she finally chose for the portfolio. So here she's literally sharpening the scythe to prepare for battle. And she has this sort of, this sort of tough look about her. You know, she's got strong worker's hands and a very stern face. On the left, this image called Outbreak. It's, again, the woman who incites the people to battle. And the rest of the figures in the crowd are mostly men and young boys. So we have a woman throwing her hands up in the air saying, go out to battle, in this sort of triangular composition. And then there's a young boy with this sort of very light face who's leading them off with his hand stretched forward and his foot stretched in the other direction. So we see this sort of ferocious and angry crowd with their scythes and their knives and anything they could find going out into battle. And in the end, they lose the battle and they are imprisoned. So this incite to riot was in fact a failed attempt. So later in her career, the artist moves from historical narratives such as the Weavers' Revolt and the Peasants' War to narratives that are, to social political realities of her own time, very much her own day. And Brenda is now going to turn to Brenda to take up this part of the conversation. And I would like to just start off with the question of how her views and how her art changed after these early narrative prints.
Okay. Thanks so much, Jay. That was a wonderful introduction to some of her really great early works. I think with the Weavers and the Peasants, we see a lot of the themes that will come up throughout her work that are already there. We see her experimenting technically and so on. And then we see her not too long after the Peasants' War. And as you mentioned, she shifts from the historical narratives to sort of realities of her daily life and of contemporary life. Some of the themes don't change. She still is interested in suffering and oppression and working class subjects, primarily the women that she knew that lived around her because she lived in a poor area of Berlin with her husband, who was a medical doctor, and she saw women every day that had many problems in their own lives. But she decided to focus more on these kinds of subjects, Like we see here with the mothers of 1919, she eventually gives up etching. You saw the very detailed finished etchings that Jay showed us, and she would move towards sort of simpler techniques like lithography and woodcut, sort of trying to seek the essence of the subject and using these more kind of straightforward techniques, always matching the subject with the content, or the form, with the form with the content. It was very important for her to have a technique that was sympathetic to the subject. And so an image like this, although it looks quite simple and straightforward, actually went through a very long gestation, a long process of studies and drawings and etchings before she arrived at this final image. 1919, the end of World War I, responding to the experiences of the women around her, the mothers, the widows, the orphans or the fatherless children. And it was always those left behind that she addressed, the issues of grief and mourning of the women who were left behind. And we see that as they crowd together for support here in community, through their gestures, through these large expressive hands, and through their faces, and just through their poses, and through the simplicity of their dress. And the idea of loss and separation from a loved one was very personal to her as well, because she did, as Jay mentioned, lose her own son, Peter, as a teenager at the beginning of World War I. And this, of course, had a great impact on her life for the rest of her life and career. She struggled to come to terms with his death. She had started off as being basically supporting the war before it began, but eventually would become an ardent pacifist and would make many images that were basically anti-war. The reason I like this print so much is because I think it brings together three of her major themes. Motherhood, we've already mentioned, the idea of death and suffering and dealing with that, and also self-portraiture. And I think I can use my cursor, so I'm just going to show you the self-portrait, which is right here in the center. And she did many, many self-portraits, and it's important to understand them, I think, to understand her work. But she did not do self-portraits, or she did not insert her own self-portrait into images that had large groups of people. So this may be one of the only ones where she did that. And again, it was a long process to come to the conclusion that this is what she should do. Here we see her, and I'll just go on to my next slide, with her two boys, as they would have looked many, many years earlier, Hans and Peter. Her arms are wrapped around them, her eyes are closed, she's isolated, she's deep in her own grief and isolation, but yet seems to be finding strength within this large community of people that are around her. She would eventually decide to do her major sort of indictment against war, in a series called War, but using a woodcut technique. And I think she thought that the stark black and white of the woodcut process was more in keeping with the harsh reality of the subject. And so here's two of the prints. The one on the right is the widow, one of the widows in the series. It shows a woman, a pregnant woman, these large hands that are protecting her young, who's unborn in the womb. And then in the other one, we have another view of mothers, but now they've become this sort of contained, compact sort of structure, a circle of mothers that are, again, banding together, but protecting their young within. And this is, I guess, a really primal instinct of motherhood, is to protect your young and to keep them safe. And so these are two of the really striking works from that series. But then she would also work back and forth across series. So here's another Mothers, this one actually called the Tower of Mothers. One of her sculptures, she made about 20 that were actually realized. She made another 20 she worked on in concept. So she was quite devoted to sculpture for several decades towards the end of her life. And it's really interesting, I think, to compare this kind of compact structure with what she had to realize in 3 dimensions in bronze. It's a little bit more dynamic. The women, you can actually see their bodies and their clothes. They seem to be moving around. There's a hand reaching out. And it's interesting just the way she works across media and sort of resolves different issues depending on what her process is. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing and come back to Jay and I having a conversation, and I'm going to see if I can see if there's any questions at this point. Okay, I don't see a question there, but I do have a question for Jay. We talked about this a little bit earlier, but I know that you've written a lot about how Kollwitz has been viewed through different lenses, through gender, biography, or social activism, and how that seems to maybe not give a full picture of her as an artist. So I wonder if you could say a few words about that, maybe. That would be great.
You know, she's such an interesting artist. She's sort of reinvented with every generation of art historians and viewers. As you said earlier, Brenda, she's an artist of her time. You know, she was an artist when the exhibition, the 2000 exhibition you worked on at the AGO regarding the Afghan War, and now she's an artist of our moment. And she's also been interpreted differently at different moments in time. In the 1890s, it was very unusual for women to be artists. And if they were artists, they were supposed to make pretty flower pictures or pictures of sweet little children or, you know, landscapes or something like that. They were definitely not supposed to make images of social and political upheaval. So in the 1890s, her work was very much described as being overly masculine, the critics would say. And they would say, you know, there was a special term for a woman like her, and that was called a man vibe, which is a man woman. And her work was perceived as so inflammatory that she was accused of taking on masculine tendencies, not in a sort of binary gender role like we would think of today, but in a very sexist way at the time. But, you know, as you mentioned, like the image of mothers from 1919, after the war, people knew that she had lost a child. And so they started talking about her images very much within the notion of empathy and being an empathetic mother, which is of course a positive thing, but then she went from being overly masculine to being only a mother. You know, her images, you can only relate to your images because she was a mother. So there, you know, and then in the 1940s and the 1930s, she was a degenerate artist. She was theoretically not, she lost her position at the Berlin Academy. She was the first woman to ever join a German art community, the Berlin Academy, and she was the first woman to ever be a professor. But then in the 1930s, with the Third Reich, she lost her studio and she lost her professorship, and she was looked at, of course, in a completely different vein by the National Socialists. And then I could go on and on about this, but then in the 1970s, with the feminist art history really gaining prominence in America, she then sort of became the mother figure for feminism, the sort of founding mother of feminist art. So as I said, over the years, there's sort of a different Kollwitz interpretation for whatever era happens to be prescient at the time.
Right. And I feel like in the past, you know, I don't know, 20 or 30 years, people have started looking at her differently and really focusing on her artistic ability, the fact, I mean, she had a lot of talent, but she also struggled as an artist, and it was that was her vocation. She was committed to her craft, to making great art, and it wasn't easy. She worked really hard. So I think a lot of times, because her work is, you know, figurative and it has this strong emotional content, that people forget that if it was only that, if it was only like highly sentimental or whatever, it wouldn't have that staying power. It's because she also created great, you know, art aesthetically. Like her work is, you know, incredibly strong, and that's why she became so well established in her own lifetime, because she really rose to the top. And I think that's one of the other reasons why her work has such staying power, because we just respond to it as, great works of art, as well as the, the social activism, the compassion, being a compassionate humanitarian and all of that. But, it's a much fuller picture than we sometimes get. We sometimes just look at her through one lens or the other. Yeah. I think we could also say a little bit about the fact that she was, this is maybe off on a bit of a tangent, but she was committed to printmaking. And, I think that's a really key aspect to think about with her too, because I think she was really good at it, and she found that out early on, that she was very good at drawing. And then she more or less taught herself. She was more or less a self-taught printmaker. But she worked really hard at it, and it was important to her because she wanted her images to go to as wide an audience as possible. And that was a way to, to really get them out there and for a lot of people to see them. For example, with the war series, she said, I didn't mention this, but she said, I want these works to go all around the world, because I want them to tell people how unspeakably difficult those years were for us. And so she even allowed those woodcuts, which would have only been produced in a small number, and before the blocks wore out, she allowed them to be zinc plated, I think, so that they could be produced in a large quantity, and the images would get out, to huge audiences. But yeah, I don't know if you want to say anything about that.
Yeah, just I think that it's such a good point that you make, that she wasn't in it to make a lot of money. She was in it mostly for social political reasons. And in the 1920s, she sold many of her early plates to a printer. And so there's earlier editions, and then the later editions which aren't as physically beautiful, but she was interested in them being reproduced and sold for lower costs for people to be able to have sort of affordable art. So I think it's a really important point you bring up. That was very important for her art to go out and to be seen.
Okay, I'm just looking at the questions because we've got just a few more minutes. So someone would like to know, how did living in the world of her physician husband, Carl, influence her work? And also, sort of related to that, there's another question about, was her father's calling as a pastor what influenced her empathy, or did it have something to do with her own poverty and, the reality of her own poverty? So do you want to take either of those, or?
Yeah, I'll start, and then you can add whatever thoughts you have, Brenda. But I think it was both households. The household she grew up in was very influential, as I mentioned, because it was a religious household, but it was also a political household. And then her own household with her husband, Carl, he had, as Brenda mentioned, he had his medical practice on one floor, and she had her studio above. So she literally was working with the urban poor. And that intertwined was a sort of religious political decision on her husband's part to work only for the urban, to be a doctor only for the urban poor. So it automatically went into her images of, pregnant women, of people that were destitute, women that had been physically abused. So it was all, they're both really good questions because they sort of show how her household really became her life and her reality.
Right. And when you read, her diaries and what her son Hans wrote about her, apparently she was a very good listener, and people came to her, and she, we know she was very compassionate, and so she really did identify closely, I think, with certainly with all the issues that they were facing, and there were some really horrendous ones, everything from poverty to unemployment, and terrible working conditions and various diseases that came along and so on. So so I think she was totally immersed in that world, and it certainly became a big part of her subject matter and her art. Okay, I think we're just about out of time, but I'm wondering if you have any last thoughts you want to share, or you.
I just, again, I would just like to,
It's been a great conversation.
absolutely. I think it's so wonderful and important how the installations and the two exhibitions that you've worked on at the AGO, and also through the generosity of Dr. McCrindle, brought her work so much to the fore in North America. And it's something that I've also tried to do at the institutions I've worked at in terms of acquisitions and incorporating her work into exhibitions. So I find her very inspirational. I think it's interesting. I think some people either find her totally depressing or totally inspirational. And I think Brenda and I happen to be the latter. But
it's a good thing we are, yeah.
So I just want to say thank you, Brenda, for all the work you've done to bring her work to the light.
Well, I just want to say thank you to Jay for being such a great colleague and giving me so much information and advice, and all the ways that she's helped me over the years, and the great work that you've done too, the publications that you've made. I would just say finally that, as Jay says, her works can be haunting and difficult, and you know, sometimes hard to look at, but I think that they draw you in, and that they cause you to reflect and think about your own life. And in the end, I do find them very inspiring too. And I think they offer, you know, hope and consolation. And I think that's really what we need right now. And I hope some of our audience feels that too. And I hope you do find them inspirational as well. And thank you all so much for joining us. And thank you so much, Jay, for taking the time to be with us. Bye for now.